inspired by the citizen protests that we are witnessing today in Havana and throughout Cuba. For it was the communist regime in Cuba that first enabled Ortega and his Sandinistas to come to power in the 1970s during its first iteration. It was Castro's Cuba which spread its misery and its malign influence throughout Latin America, including in Venezuela, and actively conspired against democratic regimes, including revolutionary violence and terrorism, which has resulted in death, destruction, and despotism. Hopefully, those days are ending, and that soon the purveyors of violence will be held to account for their atrocities and their crimes against humanity. Something I hope for is that peaceful democratic change will come to Cuba and Nicaragua and in Belarus and in China and elsewhere. I would like to thank all of our witnesses for testifying and also give special recognition to Jared Genser for his great help in bringing the wives to our commission to testify. I would also especially like to thank Bianca Jagger for her strong leadership and for accepting my invitation to testify. In 1998, Bianca testified at one of my hearings on Srebrenica and gave extraordinary witness to the betrayal of Bosnian Muslims who were killed en masse, a genocide, in July of 1995. I now yield to my friend and colleague, co-chair Jim McGovern of Massachusetts.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I join Co-Chair Smith in welcoming the witnesses and those watching online today. As we discuss the issue of the human rights crisis in Nicaragua, and just as a bit of housekeeping, I think we should, as we move forward with future hearings, there are some people on this panel, one person in particular who will be speaking in Spanish. The House has approved other platforms in which we can have simultaneous translation. And I think it would be helpful not only for us, but also for the witness to be able to understand what others are saying. So as we go forward, we might want to consider that. I want to start by expressing my deep respect and admiration for the many brave Nicaraguan victims, human rights organizations, journalists, and activists who have denounced and documented the awful human rights abuses committed since the current crisis began in April of 2018. These are people who have been putting their lives and well-being on the line from the very beginning. It is due to their efforts that international bodies like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have been able to compile comprehensive and damning reports like the one issued last October on persons deprived of liberty in Nicaragua. Sadly, many of these brave people have had to flee their country. Those who remain in Nicaragua are so vulnerable that I have been advised not to name them or mention their organizations today, because having a member of the U.S. Congress shine a light on their work in a public event could put them at even greater risk. Several declined to participate in this hearing to avoid giving the Nicaraguan authorities an excuse to go after them. The situation today is far worse now than in September of 2018, when I led the first hearing in this commission on Nicaragua. Then students and campesinos were at the forefront, motivated by the unfulfilled ideals of the Sandinista revolution, angry about the April crackdown, but also determined and full of hope. Their peaceful civic movement was a breath of fresh air. It is unfortunate that young people seem to be playing less of a leadership role now, and I regret that they're not represented here today. But during the last 2 months, the Nicaraguan state, led by President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo, has detained and imprisoned at least 27 leading figures from across the political spectrum, including the husbands of 2 of the witnesses today. I know some of those imprisoned. I've known them for decades. Without objection, I ask that their names be included in the record. In response, hundreds of people who supported the Nicaraguan Revolution in the 1980s have publicly condemned the escalating repression and widespread violation of human rights and the efforts to shut down all dissent. And without objection, I ask that the sign-on statements be entered into the record. And I take the opportunity to reiterate what I said in 2018. As someone who strongly opposed the Contra War more than 30 years ago, the Nicaragua of today is not what I was rooting for. Daniel Ortega and his wife, who once stood against Somoza's oppression, have become the oppressors. Their authoritarian turn long predates the current crackdown, and is a tragedy for the Nicaraguan people. Our solidarity must be with all those who are resisting their betrayal. This brings me to the question of what the U.S. government and Congress can do that will be constructive. In the 3 years since our last hearing, the main response to Nicaragua's return to dictatorship has been to impose economic sanctions. I personally am a believer in targeted sanctions, but they don't work in isolation. I do not support the so-called maximum pressure campaigns, the go-to approach for many in Congress. Imposing crushing across-the-board economic hardship on entire populations because of the sins of their leaders is a form of collective punishment that succeeds only in deepening humanitarian crises and increasing forced migration. What I do hope to see are coordinated multilateral initiatives that combine targeted sanctions, use of the UN and inter-American human rights system, enforcement of anti-corruption laws, auditing and strict conditioning of loans, keeping media in business, and I'm sure we can get creative here. What would be a mistake, though, would be to pretend that this crisis is just about ending the extended power grab by Ortega and Murillo. The strategies they have used to consolidate power, politicizing the judiciary, changing electoral rules in their favor, criminalizing speech and dissent on national security grounds, unleashing police on protesters, none of it is unique to them. Just last month, this commission reviewed the attacks on judicial independence throughout Central America. The Cold War is over. What is happening in Nicaragua is the struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair McGovern. I'd like to now recognize Mario Diaz-Balart. I believe he's here. Mario?
He just got an email saying he cannot join the Zoom.
Any Democrats on? I'm looking on the list.
I see Mr. LaHood is on the line.
Yes, he is. I will yield to him then next. I wanted to go to the Democrat first, back and forth. But I'd like to yield to Darren LaHood, such time as he makes it so.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Smith, for having this very important hearing today. And I'm also a proud member of the Lantos Commission, and thank you for doing this today and for the valuable testimony of our witnesses that we'll hear from today. I want to just acknowledge one of our witnesses today, and that's Rafael Estrada. I've known Rafael and have been familiar with his work and advocacy for some time. Rafael is a Nicaraguan American and president of the Free and Fair Foundation, Nicaraguans for Security and Prosperity Foundation. He currently resides in Galesburg, Illinois, which is near my hometown of Peoria. And he's got a unique story. Having fled his native country of Nicaragua at the age of 12, Rafael has been committed to fight for democracy, free and fair elections, and articulating human rights abuses throughout Nicaragua. After the socio-political crisis began in 2018, he increased his commitment and advocacy for human rights and regularly meets with members of Congress and government officials regarding the human rights abuses in Nicaragua. Mr. Estrada's foundation, which I'm familiar with, has provided aid to Nicaraguan refugees in several countries near Nicaragua and sponsors medical attention and medicine for political prisoners who have suffered torture while in custody. Rafael is a graduate of Augustana College and North Park University in Illinois, and also serves as an auxiliary lieutenant on the Knox County Sheriff's Department. And he is a businessman and philanthropist, providing aid to schools and churches in Nicaragua. I want to thank the Lantos Commission for inviting Rafael today to testify, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you to my good friend and colleague, and thank you for introducing one of our distinguished witnesses. Are there any other members on the line that would like to be recognized? If not, I'd like to introduce our first panel, and then we will take a break. Unfortunately, we have a series of votes, 3 of them, but I would like to at least introduce our distinguished panelists before going to that thing. Yeah. Okay. Our first witness needs no introduction. Bianca Jagger is founder, president, and chief executive of the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation, which she established in 2005 to be a force for change and a voice for the most vulnerable. Ms. Jagger has committed her life to defending human rights, civil liberties, peace, social justice, and environmental protection throughout the world. She works to end violence against women and girls, to abolish capital punishment, and advocates for the rights of indigenous peoples and future generations. She is Goodwill Council of Europe, I should say, Goodwill Ambassador, member of the Executive Leadership Council for the Amnesty International USA, and IUCN Bond Challenge Ambassador. She has received numerous prestigious awards, including the Right Livelihood Award 2004, and also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. As I mentioned earlier, we've had, and not just me, but others have had her provide testimony in the past. And again, I thank her for being a witness today at this critical hour. I'll then hear from Berta Valle, who is well-known Nicaraguan communicator and the wife of Felix Maradiaga, presidential candidate, political prisoner, and human rights defender. In 2018, the political persecution that her husband faced forced Ms. Valle, along with her daughter and mother-in-law, into exile abroad, where she lost all of her assets, employment, and social connections. She has not been able to return to Nicaragua. During her exile, she has promoted and created spaces for dialogue on social networks and other media to announce what is happening in Nicaragua. As a result of the enforced disappearance of her husband, she coordinates the defense teams that support him. In her 15 years of experience as an activist, she has emphasized issues of children's rights, social issues, and fundamental human rights. Then we'll hear from Victoria Cardenas, who is the wife of Cardenas, I should say, who is the wife of presidential candidate and former political prisoner, now current political prisoner, Juan Sebastian Camora. She and her family have faced oppression by the Ortega regime for her husband's activities since 2018. Mr. Cardenas, Mrs. Cardenas and her family have been the subject of politically motivated court proceedings and repression, including being targeted with an active arrest warrant. She and her has an 18-year-old daughter and is now dedicated to announcing the human rights violations that her family and so many, many others suffer. Congressman LaHood has already introduced Rafael Estrada, so I thank him for that. And then we have Onege Fornos, who's coordinator of Acción Penal, an organization that works to ensure that human and constitutional rights of political prisoners are protected through access to free and quality legal defense and document violations of due process and human rights by the government of Nicaragua. He's a lawyer and public notary with 18 years of experience, specializing in criminal law and criminal procedural law. Former public prosecutor and with more than 10 years of experience in the Nicaraguan criminal justice system, Mr. Fornos currently serves as the coordinator of Acción Penal, working to provide legal defense for political prisoners and legal representation for victims of the repression of the socio-political crisis in Nicaragua. He holds a degrees in legal strategy and policy from the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies at the National University. This witness will speak when we get to him in the order in Spanish, and we'll have an interpreter who provides the commission with translation for those who don't speak Spanish. Now, unfortunately, Jim, I think you'll agree, we need to move over to the Capitol to vote, but we will come right back. We're in a short recess, and I apologize to our distinguished witnesses for the delay, but we look forward to hearing what you have to say. We stand in recess.